Welcome back, nerds. Fino here with a guide for Richard the Lionheart. Originally, he was the New Year's servant for 2025 on the Japanese server, which means we wouldn't have seen him until 2027 on global. But in an unprecedented development, we got Richard almost a year early, presumably as a part of the marketing push for Fate's Strange Fake. I think that moving crossover servants up while their respective series are still relevant is a good development, though it certainly left me scrambling in the video making department. With that said, let's see what old Dick's got in his trousers. Much of Richard's gameplay centers on his noble phantasm, Utopia Purgatoire. This is an AoE buster attack with a preemptive 50% crit damage buff that lasts for 3 turns. It also applies a long-lasting 2k burn, and as its overcharge effect, it applies a resistance down debuff for the primary card types, Arts, Quick, and Buster. These last for 3 turns. Unfortunately, we run into a problem straight away, since, of all these properties, only the crit damage buff is preemptive. Because everything else applies after damage is dealt, Utopia Purgatoire doesn't benefit from its own debuff, at least not on the first turn you use it. Instead, this pushes you to rely on Richard's cards and follow up with big crits, which are intensified by a combination of that crit buff and resistance debuff. But if you can get his deck to play along, this can enable some nasty crit turns. And on this front, his third skill Excalibur works both halves of the equation. On one hand, it's a 30% battery to get you along towards your next NP. Just remember to take his second append skill. That'll bump you up to 50% and make your turn 1 plays more flexible. On one hand, it dumps out up to 20 stars and gives Richard 3 turn buffs to both his Buster crit damage and Buster star absorption. Unfortunately, the guy only has 2 Buster cards in his regular deck, but you can Buster Brave Shin on turns where you have both of them and his Noble Phantasm. As a general steroid, Richard has Talented in All, a 3-turn NP damage and rainbow buff that, as an additional effect, lets you target an ally and reduce their cooldowns by 1. Now, unless you happen to really like running Richard with Ash the Savior, your mileage on targeting other servants is going to be quite uneven. Instead, you're usually best off using this on Richard himself to play for value. In combination with the future Append 5, which we're getting later this year, he'll be able to reduce 2 turns on both of his skills just in the course of a regular turn 1 opener. And what do you know, all of his skills have a 6-turn cooldown at max rank, so they'll all come up at the same time. Just remember to use Talented in All as your last skill, or they'll become desynced. Lionheart Swift is the last piece of the puzzle. It's a 3-turn party attack, NP gain, and star generation buff. For Richard specifically, it also gives him another star generation buff every time he attacks for 3 turns. At this point, it's clear Richard really wants you to use his face cards. The upside is this: if everything lines up nicely, you can chain his Noble Phantasm into a crit-boosted Buster Brave or Mighty chain, either do a shitload of damage or generate resources for your next turn, and fish for another NP to hit even harder on the second go-around. While Richard can certainly heap pain upon his enemies, there are many downsides to this strategy. Firstly, normal card dependence is not a great trait to have in an AoE attacker, because under normal circumstances, you don't want to rely on card RNG unless a boss fight or challenge quest forces you to reach for very high, single-turn damage. Secondly, a lot of his value is tied up in star generation and crits, which aren't desirable in multi-core team compositions. Usually. Those are ones where you use multiple attackers. His cooldown reduction is hypothetically useful, but this applies to a narrow spectrum of servants, so if you don't have attackers like Ash, you won't necessarily see benefits in multicore. If you're fine with having Richard do all the heavy lifting, there is a way to get consistency on his card draws. He managed to beat her to the finish line on the NA server, but Ciel originally came out before him and she has a nasty trick. I've mentioned it before, so here's the relatively short version. You frontline Ciel, Summer BB, and a support, usually Coin Sky of Light or Oberon. Ciel pops her third skill to change all of your cards into hers, then you use a swap mystic code like the Decisive Battle uniform, or if you're a new player, the Chaldea Combat uniform, to switch Ciel with Richard, who's chilling in the backline. Because of card mechanics, all of Ciel's cards are now Richard's cards. Then you activate BB's third skill, Faceless Moon, to lock Richard's cards for the next 3 turns. That crit buff on Richard's NP? Now you can exploit it to the hilt. For single enemy encounters, this is good enough, but actually farming with Ciel swaps requires some finesse. Believe it or not, there are circumstances where you can farm with Richard, even at low NP levels, by doing this strategy. For single enemy waves or ones with a bunch of easy trash and a bulkier mid-boss, you can just go with an NP Buster Brave Chain to extend your reach. If card RNG allows, you could do this even without the BBCL combo, but you don't want to rely on this to farm since it makes your runs inconsistent, which is why the overwhelming majority of pre-CL strategies rely on charge management and buff stacking for your NPs. For AoE waves with multiple mid to high health enemies, you'll need to disjoint your chain. The way card RNG works for servants, ones that don't have abnormal cards, is that if you chain 3 of the same servant's cards onto a single enemy, you'll use them all on that target, even if they're dead after the first card. But Noble Phantasms force the game to check to see if your current target's dead and then move on to the next valid target. So if you go Buster NP Buster as your card order, you can deal enough damage to have your Noble Phantasm kill one of those bigger enemies, and then your last Buster card and the attached extra card can finish off the last enemy. Hypothetically. You can definitely squeeze out more damage this way, but your own charge management is going to be a matter of contention. You can't rely on stacking Coin Sky as second skill the same way that someone like CL can as a main attacker. Now Richard does have star generation and NP gain buffs, so you can instead opt to go with a mighty chain to gain resources after your NP. But you're really just begging for the game to throw you a bone at that point, because you need an enemy that won't die to your NP, but will die to the Quick Arts extra follow-up. It's asking for a lot. Event damage CEs are ideal for Richard due to him relying on both his cards and his Noble Phantasm, but those aren't always available. Black Grail is still probably the way to go in most situations. He can leverage its stat line even outside of Noble Phantasms anyway. Failing that, something like First Day of Filming is nice for its combination of NP damage, Buster effectiveness, and starting charge. Also its older cousin Aerial Drive if you don't have it. Another interesting consideration is Honey Lake, which among other things gives additional damage against burned enemies. Utopia Purgatoire does just that, though it doesn't burn preemptively, which loses you some damage. Not really practical in farming, but if you're fighting a boss and you also need Invuln Pierce, Honey Lake lets you kill 2 birds with 1 stone. If you plan to go that route, run burn command codes for consistency. Otherwise, crit damage is the way to go. Flower at the Apex of Heaven, Crossing the Sky, from the Waxing Moon Chronicles event, gives crit damage and Invuln Pierce. Richard doesn't have any way to deal with defensive impediments, so codes like this can help if you're relying on him as your primary offensive saber. Victory for Okita is one we get down the road during the Guda Guda Shinsengumi The End event, and it gives crit damage and defense ignore. Then there's Heaven Sent Karamajot for raw crit damage, and Mistress of the Heavens for Buster crit. Here's a kick in the dick. Richard has no anti-buffs. At all. So even if you wanted to go the whole hog, NP5 on top of card manipulation, you're gonna feel that upper limit on his damage. And if you go traditional with a single core setup, you'll feel it even more. That's the difference between a good generalist servant and a generic servant. Richard is much closer to the latter than he is the former. Also, Richard is in the unenviable position of being an AoE Buster's Saber. This is a role that has historically been dominated by Fate's poster girl Artoria, who's received buffs over the years to keep her competitive. He's on the clock because in less than 2 years, we're getting Lord Logris, who's another Artoria, and this one's blatantly overtuned. Richard releasing early also raises the question of whether we'll get another time shift as the New Year's servant for 2027. Worst case scenario, Logris is that servant, and they'll just dump her items into the Pure Prism shop. While Richard has exploitable qualities on paper, he has a lot of elements working against him, both in the design of his skill set and the competition he's up against. And frankly, it's a lot of work to keep pace with a servant like Artoria, who can just NP 3 times and call it a day, while still dealing massive damage. You know, I had someone ask if Richard releasing early would affect the top 10 servants list I put out for this year, and to be honest, he wouldn't even make the honorable mentions. Ain't that a shame? Now on to story time. As usual, I'm not a historian, I just like a good story, so take what you're about to hear with a grain of salt. Jumping into this period of time head first is pretty confusing, so here's the need to know. The Viking tide had washed over Western Europe, shattering the old order. While the Vikings themselves would lose cohesion, especially in the West, the alliances they formed and the lands they took set the stage for this new act of history. A showdown had been brewing between the Normans, Viking settlers of the French coast, Norwegians who desired the rebirth of Canute's North Sea Empire, and the Anglo-Saxons who had reclaimed England after the collapse of said empire. In a series of decisive battles, where king and commoner alike met their end, the Norwegians were defeated by the Anglo-Saxons, who were in turn vanquished by the Normans. This established a dynasty that had control over both England and Normandy across the Channel. But things went to shit pretty quickly, devolving into something called the Anarchy, where rival successors went to town on each other in England. And there was even a point where both leaders were captured by the other side, forcing them to release each other so they could go back to fighting. Crazy shit. And the end result was that a man named Henry Plantagenet came out on top. Henry II, as we know him. He was the son of the Duke of Anjou over on the continent, which is where the Angevin Empire gets its name. Through a mix of birthright, conquest, and marriage, Henry and his family gained control over the western half of France, extending all the way down to the Spanish border. Suffice it to say, the French didn't much like this state of affairs. Henry had many sons, something that would cause him a never-ending headache. His succession plans involved dividing up Angevin lands between them, at least administratively, but they weren't satisfied. Whether on account of the pace of succession, the lands they were given, the way those lands were being managed in the present, and so on. So they, including one named Richard, all jumped Henry in the span of a year, roping in their personal forces, disgruntled barons, foreign powers, and even the French king, who they were technical subjects of. TLDR, the French crown gave some Vikings Normandy in exchange for nominal submission and defending that stretch of land from other Vikings, which would keep them out of the parts of France that the king and his nobles did control. But get this, Henry? He just starts dumpstering them. The Flemish, pow! The French, into the bin. His sons, absolutely manhandled. At one point, the King of Scotland came in from the north and actually got captured for his trouble. Seems like old Henry's a bit of a badass. But even at this moment, it's undeniable that while Henry II was really good at defeating his enemies, he seemed to have a knack for making a lot of enemies in the first place, from places that you'd have expected to be in his corner. Henry forgave his sons, because to do otherwise would destroy his dynastic plans. But he did keep their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, under close guard. Not only had she supported her sons in their rebellion, but they might think twice about causing trouble while she's under lock and key. Especially Richard, whom she favored to the point that he was in charge of her home, Aquitaine in the south of France. It didn't pay off, and about 10 years later, Richard was once again in opposition to his father. This time his brothers came as enemies, including the official heir, Henry the Young King. You want to know the reason he's called Henry the Young King and not Henry III? That's because he dies right here. While on campaign against Richard, he caught the shits from hell and it was all over. This created a very messy situation for Henry the still living king, because Richard was next in line. So he said, "Fine, I'll forgive you. You're the heir now, just give Aquitaine to your brother." The brother in question was John the Fuck-Up, not his historical name, but he is the one who, in time, will oversee the collapse of the Angevin Empire and be forced to sign some terms and conditions that we know as the Magna Carta. But this isn't John's story. Not yet. Here I can kinda see why Henry drew so much aggro from his own household, because Aquitaine had significance to Richard. He'd spent 10 years cleaning the place up, putting down rebels, and establishing fortifications. It was his power base, the men that had rallied to him when his brothers came invading. It was also the birthright of his mother who, was still in captivity. To Richard it must have looked an awful lot like an attempt to kneecap him, kick him upstairs. So Richard said, "That's not happening." Richard, wary of his father's intentions, would get in bed with the French king. Literally. The two made an alliance and sealed it by sleeping in the same bed, which sounds remarkably homosexual on a first read, but supposedly it was a symbolic thing and no ships set sail that night. So take that as you will. Besides, the French King Philip II's sister was already Richard's fiancée. Richard and Philip marched against Henry and defeated him in battle, forcing him to name Richard his heir with no strings attached. And after decades of fighting, including against his own family, the exhausted Henry would die mere days after making this agreement. Richard had become king at last. But while Richard and Philip were making nice, events on the other side of the world would dictate the next chapter of their lives. The King of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, had made a strategic blunder, and though his army was camped within marching distance of drinkable water, they could not reach it on account of being surrounded. Through the night, they were tormented by thirst and heat, camped out on flat land that left them exposed to the elements and the intentions of their enemies. These foes compounded their suffering by setting fires in their vicinity and filling the night with a tremendous cacophony, so that not even sleep could abate their suffering. In the morning, they were forced into battle through plumes of smoke and hails of arrows, bringing ruin to the trapped army. While his mercenaries, many hired with money sent by Henry II, either died or deserted, Guy mounted a desperate, ferocious charge with his corps of knights. If he could not defeat the army, then he would kill its commander. They carved a bloody path until their adversary was in sight. Sounds like something right out of Alexander's playbook. Charge your cavalry straight at the enemy commander to test their mettle. But Guy was no Alexander, and his adversary was made of much stronger stuff than Darius. This was a man named Salah ad-Din, or as we know him in the West, Saladin. The charge failed to reach Saladin, who stood his ground until the remaining knights were worn down to a dull edge. With few exceptions, those who didn't die that day wound up as his prisoners, leaving Jerusalem virtually defenseless. It fell soon after, its strength gambled away on this boondoggle. When Richard and Philip heard the news, they swore to go on crusade to retake it. Seems like an odd policy position, given how unstable things had been in their neck of the woods. But even beyond any personal piety they may have had, taking up the cross had political benefits. For one, it tended to make the Pope happy, and in pre-Reformation Europe, the Pope was the only game in town for religious legitimacy. Unless you wanted to go Orthodox and make nice with the Byzantines, which Westerners generally didn't at this point in time. There were a number of reasons for that, but the big one here is that the Byzantines were a little too eager to cut bait during the First Crusade. So yeah, if you were presenting yourself as a divinely appointed king, it helped to keep the Pope on side. Secondly, it was understood that if you went on crusade, the other Christian powers wouldn't fuck with you in transit or your stuff in your absence, so you could go on crusade to freeze any problems you had with your neighbors. But going on crusade was very expensive, and to that end, Richard liquidated royal assets and sold official positions to raise the necessary funds for his army. Apparently his father had established quite a robust tax base during his reign, which Richard was happy to lean on. Okay, I'm gonna play fast and loose with the rest of the story because this is getting significantly longer than I intended. On the way to the Holy Land, Richard stopped by Sicily for some dynastic business. His sister had been imprisoned by the Sicilians. She married their late king, whose succession plans put the island at risk of influence by the Holy Roman Empire. In exchange for his sister, and all the money that was sent as her dowry, Richard legitimized the new Sicilian king. This royally pissed off Henry VI, the soon-to-be Holy Roman Emperor, who was in fact trying to get influence over Sicily. But let's put a lid on that for now. On the next leg of his journey, a storm scattered his fleet, and a part of it ended up on Cyprus, where shipwrecked sailors were imprisoned by its ruler. This was Byzantine territory, but one in revolt. It's a long story. The important part is that none of this stopped Richard from making landfall and conquering it. He taxed the shit out of Cyprus to replenish his coffers, and later sold it off to the Knights Templar so he wouldn't have to worry about administering it. With that business taken care of, Richard set off to Acre on the continent, where the other crusaders were setting up a siege. It worked, and they were able to compel the garrison to surrender after an extended back and forth. In this victory, 3 banners were unfurled from the walls of Acre: the Angevin flag, the French flag, and the Austrian flag? So Austria at this point was a part of the Holy Roman Empire, but said Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, had drowned up north while leading his massive army across a river. On one hand, the guy swam into a river in full armor. What did he think was going to happen? On the other hand, the Byzantines caught a lot of flack for this, because prior to this point, Barbarossa's army had been marching through their territory, and the two had a number of battles and skirmishes. It's one of those things where, yeah, Barbarossa was marching a huge-ass army through their territory when the two weren't very friendly in the first place. But on the other hand, the Byzantines were at that point ruled by a dynasty of lunatics and psychopaths, a part of the reason why Cyprus had been in revolt. And pretty much every decision they made was worse than just letting Barbarossa pass through. But for Richard's story, the important part is this. Leopold, the Austrian duke, was neither an emperor nor a king. For Leopold to put Austria's flag on the walls of Acre implied that he was Richard's equal, when he was just the subject of the Holy Roman Emperor. Never mind that, technically Richard himself was the subject of the French king. But feeling insulted by the implications, Richard threw the banner of Austria down from the walls of Acre. This pissed Leopold off, and the Austrians left the crusade. The French King Philip dropped out soon after. His motivations are a bit opaque, but there are a number of possibilities. One is that a number of his neighboring rulers had died during the siege, which meant there were power vacuums back west. Another is that Richard had broken off the engagement to his sister. It may have been for political reasons. The woman he did marry held a part of northern Spain, which would secure Aquitaine's southern border. Or it may have been something far more salacious. You see, there were rumors that Philip's sister, who had been sent to Henry II's court, was taken by Richard's father as a mistress and even bore his child. This would have been a humiliating partner for Richard, so he broke off the marriage. And of course, the third possibility is that Philip just wanted to run back west and take Richard's shit while he was busy. Pope be damned. He'd just leave some of his army under a subordinate, so the pontiff would have to think twice about complaining. But regardless of why, Richard was now the main muscle of the Third Crusade. His first act in this role was a brutal one. He executed the prisoners that the Crusaders had taken during the siege. Maybe it was the logistics of feeding them, maybe it was to avoid leading potential hostiles behind him, or maybe it was bloodlust. But regardless of why, he killed them all. He then led the Crusader army south along the coast, where he could be replenished by ship. He was aware of the mistakes that Guy de Lusignan had made, in part because the man himself had survived his defeat and was a part of the crusading force. So he kept his army relatively well rested, out of the midday sun, and well provisioned. Saladin would probe Richard's defenses with harassing attacks, but Crusader discipline and a wealth of crossbowmen allowed them to keep cohesion as they marched along. Seeing that the Crusaders would eventually reach something important if he couldn't stop them, Saladin used his knowledge of local terrain to set up an ambush in a wooded section of the coastline. While the Crusaders were strong, their strategy made them very slow, so Saladin could move troops ahead of their path. Once the army was thoroughly embedded in this forest, Saladin struck. His skirmishers surrounded the crusading army and began pelting them with projectiles. And at particular intervals, they'd part to make a path for his horse archers, who would charge in at speed, unleash a powerful volley, and wheel around. This is the point at which your typical Western army would charge out in pursuit, get strung out, and then get obliterated. But Richard and the veteran Crusaders were familiar with this tactic, and Richard ordered his men not to give chase until he gave the signal. You see, Saladin's method of attack applied an immense amount of pressure, but it was also exhausting to the attacker. These constant formation changes also required a degree of finesse, and the longer it went on, the greater the odds that someone would slip up and the gears of Saladin's finely oiled machine would seize up. But Richard's plan was not without risks of its own. The attrition from enduring this hail of arrows would take its toll on the Crusaders, and especially the cavalry, whose horses were much more likely to be hit in this enclosed formation. In particular, the Knights Hospitaller had been placed on the left flank of this formation, and they were enduring a special dose of pain, being attacked from two directions. They begged and pleaded with Richard to attack, but the latter refused. But in time, they could endure no more and charged out on their own. If the Hospitallers went down, the Crusaders would be destroyed soon after, so Richard signaled for a general attack. While it wasn't quite the ideal timing he had in mind, it was good enough. The Ayyubids were growing tired from their repeated maneuvers, and their movements were getting sloppy. When the Crusaders came out with an explosion of violence, they were caught unawares. In particular, the wing that had been pressing the Hospitallers had allowed themselves to get too close, and they were engulfed before they had a chance to pull back. Realizing what had just happened, the rest of Saladin's army gave in to fear and began routing, fleeing from the battlefield. Normally, this is where they'd get pursued by the bloodthirsty victors, but Richard called for a halt. He knew that chasing an army with so many horse archers would be a foolish endeavor, and essentially falling for a trap he had spent all this time trying to avoid. Perhaps if Richard had his way and the Hospitallers held on for longer, then he could have drawn Saladin's entire army into the Crusader maw. But it was not to be. The upside is that Saladin was indeed reeling, and he couldn't risk another pitched battle, so the Crusaders had a free hand to conquer the coastline. However, their maneuvers inland toward Jerusalem proved much more inconclusive. Here, Richard proposed a daring plan. In the aftermath of the previous battle, the Crusaders had captured the fortress of Ascalon. This was the main gateway into Egypt, Saladin's power base. Richard wanted to ride into Egypt and wreak havoc, destroying Saladin's capacity to hold or threaten Jerusalem in the future. But the other Crusaders saw this as a major detour when Jerusalem was right there. Richard may have had a huge chunk of the crusading force, but he had zero chance of taking Egypt without the entire army, so he was forced to give up this scheme. At some point in this whole process, a man named Conrad of Montferrat was elected as king by the Crusaders. Richard actually opposed this, favoring the fuck-up Guy of Lusignan. Presumably this was because Guy was from the west of France and would have become his problem otherwise. But get this, within days of being proclaimed king, Conrad would be assassinated by the capital A assassins. No one knows exactly why they did it, whether to settle a beef with Conrad or on behalf of one of Conrad's many other enemies. But pretty much everyone who mattered thought Richard was behind it and was just using the assassins as a scapegoat. While he faced no reprisals in the moment, this episode damaged Richard's reputation back west. After more inconclusive campaigning, Richard gave up and went to the negotiating table with Saladin. He got a peace treaty, acceptance of most of the Crusader gains along the coast, and the right for Christians to make pilgrimages to Jerusalem, even though it remained in the Ayyubid orbit. Richard had to cut his losses and return to Western Europe ASAP. Word had gotten back to him that Philip and his brother John were in cahoots to overthrow him. So Richard set sail and lost his ship on the first leg of the voyage. He was forced to ground in the Holy Roman Empire, and people didn't much like him there. So he put on a disguise, pilgrim robes. Except, yeah, this huge guy with red blonde hair wasn't fooling anyone. While he was making his way through Austria, he was apprehended by men in service to Leopold. Remember how Richard threw his banner off the walls of Acre? Leopold certainly did. And remember Conrad of Montferrat, the guy everyone thinks Richard killed? Yeah, he was Leopold's cousin, so now we have beef squared. What Leopold would have done to Richard with a free hand, nobody knows, because word got out, and the Pope was absolutely furious. Rule 2 of crusading is that you don't fuck with crusaders in transit, so the Pope excommunicated Leopold. But not willing to release Richard, Leopold opted to play hot potato, giving custody of Richard to the new Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI. And Henry had beef with Richard for the stunt he pulled in Sicily, among other things. Excommunicating Henry was not something the Pope was willing or perhaps even able to do, given his own political situation. And as a consequence, Richard languished. Philip II and John wanted to pay Henry to either hand Richard over to them or to imprison him indefinitely, but Henry didn't want any part of that. In the end, Richard paid a massive ransom for his own freedom. Luckily, he didn't leave John in charge of the empire and instead had appointed men who were still loyal to him, and they dutifully sucked the people dry to free their master. To remove the stain on his honor from his imprisonment, Richard had a second coronation for himself. As for John, Richard forgave his little shit of a brother because he had no other heir. The woman he married while on crusade? He'd send her back west, and the two would not meet again in his lifetime. Philip had been biting off bits of territory during his absence, and Richard was out for payback. But campaigning was expensive. That's when Richard learned that an old hoard of gold was uncovered at Limoges, and Richard, who'd just blown the Empire's budget several times over, was hell-bent on getting it. The local lord was like, "Fuck no, it's mine," so Richard put his lands to siege. Here his fate would be sealed. During one of his attacks, Richard had taken off some of his armor because it was hot, and he was up against some cobbled-together militia, not a real threat. That's when one of them let loose a crossbow bolt that got him right in the shoulder. This wound became infected, and soon Richard realized he didn't have long to live. He ordered the culprit to be brought before him. "Why did you shoot me?" Richard asked. The boy did not beg for his life, but said, "You killed my father, and you killed my brothers." "I see. Go, get out of here. This boy's not to be harmed." After a life of violence, the Lionheart's last act would be a magnanimous one. But alas, it would be sullied. You see, the boy never left camp. He was intercepted by one of Richard's men, well, a mercenary more like, and instead of honoring the last wish of his commander, he thought, this little punk just killed the golden goose, so he decided some proper retribution was in order. The regicide was to be flayed alive. For those of you not familiar, think of it when a hunter shoots an animal. After it's dead, they skin it for the fur or to get access to the meat. Well, it's like that, except you're still living when it happens, and the whole purpose is that you're in impossible agony. Not such a happy ending. Really, it seems like things go to shit for most of the factions involved in this story. John would run the Angevin Empire straight into the ground, losing most of its French possessions within a few years. Saladin would actually die 6 years before Richard, and while his Ayyubid Sultanate would last a little longer, his heirs were not up to his caliber, and his empire would implode after 67 more tumultuous years. What an unfortunate place for that number to pop up. Leopold, who had imprisoned Richard, had his foot destroyed by a falling horse. When this became infected, none of his retainers had the balls to cut it off, so Leopold essentially had to do it himself, with a few servants he coerced into assisting. But it was too late, and the infection had spread, condemning him to death. The Holy Roman Empire Henry VI had his plans to absorb Sicily blown up by a fuming pope, remembered Henry's disobedience on the matter of Richard's captivity. Also, letting him integrate it fully into the Holy Roman Empire risked making him too powerful anyway. Then when Henry died, his empire descended into 17 years of civil war. Even the papacy was not to escape the entropy of the times. While Pope Celestine III would die of old age, his successor Innocent III would initiate the catastrophic Fourth Crusade, which would be hijacked by the Venetians and launched against Constantinople in one of Christendom's worst own goals. The only one who seems to have made it out all right is Philip II, who directly benefited from John's incompetence and recaptured substantial swaths of French territory, including Anjou, which is why, after John, the Angevins are referred to as the Plantagenets. As for Philip's descendants, they'd keep the ship afloat until we ran into them next. You may remember one of them, Philip the Fair, who played a major role in the story of Jacques de Molay. I have videos on both her and Jeanne d'Arc, who came along a little later, so take a look on the channel if that interests you. Thanks for watching, lads. This video spiraled completely out of control in the length department, but let me know if you like this sort of ultra-long video, or if the leaner servant stories are more to your liking. This weekend, I've got a lot going on. Twitch.tv/Finotaisen. I stream every weekend at 3 p.m. Pacific time. See you there.